Welcome, everyone. This is the Leveraging U.S. Forest Service BIL Funds for Source Water Protection. This is part of a bipartisan infrastructure law webinar series that the Source Water Collaborative has put on. I'm Sylvia Malm with the Groundwater Protection Council, and I also work with the National Source Water Collaborative. We're a member. I'm joined by my partner, Kathy Hawes, who will be helping facilitate the Q&A portion of this webinar. She's with the Southeast Partnership for Forests and Water, and we're very excited to have this webinar launched today. I heard a blurb on the Endangered Species Act for Earth Day today, and the interesting thing to me was how they mentioned the importance of collaborative partnerships. And that's really what we focus on to do our source water protection work. And there's a lot of opportunities, particularly this bipartisan infrastructure law, which is historic levels of funding. And we have great speakers today. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping reminders. You'll see a Q&A box and a chat box on the bottom of your page or for your the Zoom webinar, and it's important to put your questions in the Q&A box. You can upvote those by clicking on the thumbs up, and if it's an important question to you, that it'll help us to know that a lot of people are interested in a particular question. That will help us prioritize. And the chat box is there for discussion as well. So we encourage use of both, but be sure your questions go in the Q&A box. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to kick off details about this webinar. We have a great series of speakers, and I wanted to just highlight that for you. We have Jim Capurso with the USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest region, and he is going to be covering some great information, an overview of both BIL and the Inflation Reduction Act as an extra, and also he'll be talking about the Drinking Water Providers Partnership. Shasta Ferranto, also from the Northwest Forest Service region, is going to be talking about wildfire risk reduction across the National Forest System. And Matt Piccirillo from the Rio Grande Water Fund and the Nature Conservancy will be talking about the Rio Grande Water Fund adapting to meet the moment, and we'll be giving you a great perspective from the outside of the U.S. Forest Service perspective and leveraging partnership opportunities. Julie Harvey from the Oregon Department of Environment and Quality is going to be talking from her perspective as the Drinking Water Protection Program Manager on working with the U.S. Forest Service in Oregon. And Kathy Hawes, as I mentioned, is going to be our Q&A roundup person, and she'll be helping us get questions answered from the Q&A portion of this webinar at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the webinar, if there's time, we'll open up for additional questions. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the National Source Water Collaborative. We started in 2006, actually when I was at EPA in the Source Water Program. There were 15 founding members, and now we have 30. The Forest Service is a member, NRCS, NACD, EPA, water utility organizations, and state associations, and others like National Rural Water Association. So it's a great group. USGS is also a member. You can see all the logos here. And we were formed to focus on a common goal of protecting public drinking water sources, which is a voluntary effort. And so it's important to work with a range of partners who are operating on the land and influencing land management. And this has been an experience we're excited to put on this webinar. On the Source Water Collaborative website, you'll also see a number of other resources. This webinar, the BIL webinar page has the recordings from previous webinars, and also we'll have the recording of this one, but we also have toolkits, fact sheets, and other resources. We have information about Source Water Collaborative efforts across the country at the state, local, and watershed level. So I encourage you to check out the entire website. Next slide. So this gives you an overview of the previous webinars that we've done and had addressed to include a diverse audience, encouraging them to reach out and understand how to access funds from the bipartisan infrastructure law. So you can see that the previous webinars are available as a recording online and with associated resources. We're doing ours here today, and then there's one on May 30th, and you can access the QR code here on this slide to register for that one. Next slide. Oh, excuse me. Now we're at the part, sorry. We are now at the part where we want to launch our first poll. So I'm going to give us a few minutes to do that. We wanted to get a sense of who our audience is here today, both for you all to see who's here with you, and for our speakers as well. As I mentioned, it's a diverse partnership that can put forward source water protection at the state and local level, and you'll see them represented in these different choices. And Christine, just give me a sense, or somebody give me a sense of when we're done. It looks like we're at a point with some results, and it looks like there's in the lead a large percentage, about a third of the audience is with state sort of source water protection programs. And I know there's a great deal of interest in working with the Forest Service here. Also some state forestry programs, local governments, and then drinking water utilities, also very important partners to work with. And I know from conversations with the speakers that there are definitely examples of where that's taking place. Okay. Thank you. Now I'm going to introduce Jim Capurso, who is a PhD regional fisheries biologist with the Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest region. Jim, in this presentation, is going to give us a quick overview of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, so you get a bonus, and highlight some potential aquatic-related funding opportunities within them. He's also going to talk with you about the Drinking Water Providers Partnership, which is a unique partnership between the states of Oregon and Washington, and two or three federal agencies, and it's unique, and there's been a lot of interest in this. So we'd like to encourage you to particularly pay attention to that, and we'd like to know that it might be replicated across the country. Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sylvia. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Hey, and thanks for inviting me to talk about the Drinking Water Providers Partnership. And then I'll touch base on a couple law funding opportunities during this presentation. So the content of this presentation includes some review of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act and potential funding opportunities for doing watershed work. And primarily, I'll be talking about the Drinking Water Providers Partnership. So let's talk about these two funding sources, because Sylvia asked me to talk about these. And the first one I'll cover is Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It appears that this is a series of webinars associated with this law, and so I'll just provide some brief overviews. This law was signed by President Biden in November 2021 to invest in the nation's infrastructure and competitiveness. The law provides the Forest Service. The law is extremely complex, and the different funding mechanisms that are there and where the funding goes. I'm going to focus primarily on the Forest Service. The Forest Service was provided $5.5 billion over 5 years through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to reduce wildfire risk, to improve wildland fire management, to invest in wildland firefighters, to restore ecosystems and watersheds, and to repair infrastructure, especially roads, trails, and recreation-related facilities. So the bill includes Shasta will be, and the next presenter will be talking about the fire management perspective of the law. I want to focus in on a couple different funding mechanisms you may be also interested in that are associated with watershed restoration. That includes $25.5 million over the next 5 years for collaborative aquatic landscape restoration program. That's the aquatic equivalent to the collaborative forest landscape restoration program that's been in existence for several years prior to the law. Approximately $40 million per year for the Legacy Roads and Trails program. That historically has been an extremely successful program for dealing with our legacy roads and trails issues across national forest lands. $100 million per year for invasive species management. And then, as I mentioned, Shasta will kind of cover this, pre and post fire funding, pre 3.5 billion and post 100 million funding for watershed resilience. I thought it was really important to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act in this presentation, because this is a funding source that will be available, that is available, and it will be available longer than the bill as the bipartisan infrastructure laws beginning to fade out. This will be continuing. It was signed into law by President Biden in August 2022 to curb inflation, while addressing numerous issues, including climate change, jobs, healthcare, energy security. It provided the Forest Service with $5 billion over the next 9 years for fuels and forest health treatments to protect communities from wildfire, for competitive grants to non-federal forest landowners. It's funding for state and private forestry programs and for administrative costs for implementation. Specifically, the funding that, as a fisheries biologist with the Forest Service, what we're involved with is $200 million for what the law calls vegetation watershed management, and it's funding used for water source protection. And it includes funding for capacity building, planning, and implementation. There's some requirements specifically with this component, this funding source, that's a component of the Inflation Reduction Act. And these requirements include these activities must be on Forest Service land. The project must be carried out in accordance with either a watershed condition framework, watershed restoration action plan, or a water source management plan. With that said, I want to talk the rest of the presentation. I want to share the Drinking Water Providers Partnership with you, in that this partnership has used components of both those funding mechanisms in the past. In fact, this year, 2024, we've used the funding from the IRA for funding of the Drinking Water Providers Partnership. And so 50% of water used in the Western United States originates from national forests. 65% of Oregonians and 40% of Washingtonians rely primarily upon surface water for their drinking water sources. Municipal watersheds, however, in the Pacific Northwest, and I'd venture a guess to say throughout the United States, have challenges associated with them. And you can see some of these challenges in this slide. And there's some issues with protecting municipal watersheds. For instance, the Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't provide regulatory authority for communities to protect their drinking water. Few towns own their own source watersheds, and primarily just large towns and cities have capacity to protect or restore source watersheds. Keeping all these challenges in mind, GEOS Institute and the Pacific Northwest region of the Forest Service got together in 2014 and started to discuss ways they might develop a municipal watershed focused partnership. The intent was to identify, implement, and monitor watershed restoration with municipal watersheds, benefiting watershed and fisheries resources, protecting and restoring water quality and quantity, and decreasing water treatment costs. In other words, we are looking at delivering clean and inexpensive drinking water and looking at mutual benefits to municipal watersheds and working within that sweet spot, that overlap between those different areas. So the Forest Service and GEOs developed a concept to establish this partnership on bringing together water providers who want to improve their source watersheds but lack the funding or resources to do so. We wanted to bring together restoration practitioners to the table that have the expertise and capacity to restore watersheds. And we wanted to bring land managers to the table that often are own major parts of municipal watersheds and manage those areas. So in 2014, the Forest Service and GEOS Institute introduced this partnership concept to municipal water providers in the Cascade Mountain Range and in the Coastal Mountain Range of Oregon. And the idea was met with great support. After those meetings, we began to introduce water providers with local restoration practitioners, and we stood back and watched the magic happen. These folks were already horse training and providing ways to each other that they may be able to work together within municipal watersheds. But we heard clearly from these initial discussions that they needed some type of external funding source that they can use towards funding their new collaborations that were established at a grassroots level. So in 2015, a regional partnership officially formed in response to the grassroots partners' request for a funding source. That included Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, Washington Department of Health, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Bureau of Land Management, and some NGOs, including Wild Earth Guardians, as I mentioned before, the GEOS Institute. We pooled our resources and both financial and in-kind in 2015 to provide that funding source. And then later in 2018, the Freshwater Trust joined us. So the goals of the partnership are to restore and protect the health of watershed communities, dependent upon drinking water, while also benefiting aquatic and riparian ecosystems, including native fish that inhabit them. And then to encourage and support local partnerships between water providers and restoration practitioners. So a little background on the partnership is that, and eligibility, anyone could apply for the funds in Oregon and Washington. The public drinking watersheds have to be within Oregon or Washington. For best consideration of project proposals, they should be in or near Forest Service priority watersheds. They should be in or near BLM, Bureau of Land Management priority watersheds. And in Oregon, they should be in sensitive areas identified in updated source water assessment delineations. So the project types that we've funded includes things like feasibility assessments, planning, design, outreach, education, and monitoring. And the work addresses water quality and quantity issues within a drinking water system, benefiting native fish and their habitat. The partnership is 8 years old now, and during that time, I was just doing the numbers last week. I'm surprised and very glad to see that so far we as a partnership have helped fund 118 projects. and those projects also brought in other funding from other entities to implement. So we've invested so far about $6 million in partner funds towards these type of projects. Let me give you an example of some of these projects. Going from left to right, we've fixed many fish migration barriers already. This is one picture here of a fish migration barrier, undersized road stream crossing at Grant Creek within the town of Glide, Oregon's water supply. We've also done a lot of education or funded a lot of education and outreach. This is an effort we supported near the town of Leavenworth, Washington. It's an Icicle Creek, which is a wilderness area and that gets a lot of use, and that use has impacted water quality within the system, and the outreach has helped address that issue. Another project is fencing off a municipal watershed for the city of Baker City in Oregon that used to have livestock used to have access to it, and they've had cryptosporidian issues within the watershed, and now livestock is excluded from that municipal watershed. And then we removed a road crossing barrier from the North Umpqua River, providing improving water quality for Glide, Oregon. A few other projects that we've helped fund. We've helped to fund development of a sediment reduction project prioritization model for the city of Medford, Oregon. We funded several water restoration projects that included large wood addition. This one pictured here is in Reel Creek, which is in the municipal watershed of the city of Dallas, Oregon, near Salem. Well, we restored several projects that returned flood flows back into flood plains by increasing the elevation of valley bottoms. These include Deer Creek, South Fork Mackenzie River, and Mackenzie River for the city of Eugene, Oregon. And then we continue to host workshops across Oregon and Washington, connecting water providers with restoration practitioners and funding sources. Lately, that emphasis, as we're putting these together, there's an emphasis on serving Justice 40 communities. This last slide has my contact information and then my colleagues, the other members of the board for the Drinking Water Providers Partnership on it. And you can see that there's a website up on the top there, and that link, as you get access to this slideshow, you can click on that. I think the link will be provided elsewhere. And a website that's maintained by GEOS Institute that tells you all about the Drinking Water Providers Partnership and has some more summaries of projects we've funded in the past. With that, I'll stop sharing. I think there might be time for some questions.
Jim, if you want to leave that slide up there so people have time to write down some of that information on how to reach you, that would be great.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No,
do that. Let me do that now.
Not at all. We do have a couple of questions that came in. They're closely tied together, and this is about proving the projects that are funded under this program. Is there a requirement to prove that the project will result in a direct benefit to drinking water quality, or alternately drinking water treatment cost reduction? Or is it determined on other factors?
It's so I didn't include these slides, but the process is these grassroots partnerships. Well, the whole partnership, the Drinking Water Providers Partnership, is really exciting because there's two levels. It's like a dual level partnership. We encourage these grassroots partnerships on the ground between restoration practitioners and municipal watershed managers. And as they provide projects for us to fund, we have a call for projects in the fall, and then at the beginning of the calendar year, we fund those projects. We being the people that are listed here on this last slide. And so we really have that discussion on the degree we think that these projects would benefit drinking water quality and quantity.
Similarly, you mentioned a prioritization study that was done in Medford. Do you have one for the entire watershed that you're working with, or do some of your projects have those and some don't?
That model was a proposal before the Freshwater Trust joined our board. They put in a presentation or a proposal to fund that project. They developed that model for the city of Medford, and it's for their whole municipal watershed. However, that model could be something that would be applicable towards other watersheds, and that would be something to contact Mark McAllister, who's the Habitat Restoration Director for the Freshwater Trust, to get more details on.
Yeah, I'm familiar with a few different types of methodologies for determining that prioritization. And what is the connection to NRCS's source water protection areas? Is the area that you work in part of that? Do you know?
Yeah, you know, with NRCS, we are recently contacting NRCS, as in over the last month, asking them if they'd have interest in participating in our partnership. We haven't successfully landed on a date yet, but we want to invite NRCS to join the Drinking Water Providers Partnership because we think that they have a lot of expertise, particularly in ag lands, and a lot of contacts that would be really valuable towards this partnership. We'll let you know how that goes.
Yeah, great. And also programs to connect with those private landowners. And that's one of the questions that we've got. Are you working with any large private forest landowners? And are those projects producing any water quality credits?
Trying to think back at the folks that we have funded, the projects we funded to date. And I think some of them may have additional partners that are large forested or forest industry companies. But as far as actually funding a timber industry company, I don't think we have so far. But you can go to the website, the Geos Institute website, where all of our projects that we funded are listed there. And there's photographs and great summaries on each. And you can see if I'm wrong.
Okay. All right. Here's a question. How does one find which watersheds are priority watersheds? In what way does the watershed need to provide drinking water or be related to drinking water? In other words, does municipal well pumping from the basin off National Forest Service lands downstream qualify for that?
Yeah, that's a big question. And let me know when I run out of time. I can definitely answer the first one really quick. And that's, how do you know whether it's a priority watershed? So another thing to Google would be watershed condition framework. And that's really what particularly in the Pacific Northwest, but in regions throughout the Forest Service network, that's what really directs where we do restoration. And it prioritizes watersheds for restoration. And so each forest has their priority watersheds within the region. And those are areas that are mapped, and you can identify where those areas are as you learn more about watershed condition framework and working with Forest Service hydrologists and fisheries biologists at the forest and regional levels. That was the first part of that question. And then that conjunctive management thing between groundwater and surface water is a really important thing and pretty complex. We as a board have been talking about that. And I think recently we have funded a groundwater project. So we recognize that interrelationship between groundwater and surface water. I would say, as you look through the list of projects we funded, 99% of our projects are surface water related.
Okay. All right. One final question for you. You said that you all have funded over 118 projects. I think that was what you said.
It's
Do you
amazing.
have a favorite? Do you have a favorite out of all those?
Yeah, and actually, you've probably seen the glow in my face when I talk when I was talking about the city of Baker City. I was there. I was staying in Baker City, working, and when there was an advisory to you drink bottled water, and so I was personally impacted by that the cryptosporidian issue that the city was facing, and so when this project was proposed to us, it was something we all got immediately on board and were really supportive because it just totally makes sense, that if you fence off the drinking water supply for Baker City from livestock access, you would likely have a better drinking water quality. And so that's, for personally, I think that's probably one of my favorites because it's like it just totally makes sense, and there's a everybody was willing to do it, and so the local Forest Service was instrumental in getting that project implemented.
Right. All right. I wanted to mention in chat, there's a link to the watershed condition framework map viewer that you had mentioned. So somebody put that in there for us. That's helpful. And I guess we can go from here. You guys can write down the contact information. We'll have plenty of resources on our website following this webinar. And if you want to go ahead and launch the next poll, then we'll get some insight from our audience.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Jim. This was great. And in the chat, you have a volunteer from Idaho NRCS to join. So, Maureen, I think Maureen has some experience in your region as well. So I recommend her. Okay, we'll give a few minutes for the poll to run. This is to get a sense of which U.S. Forest Service contacts you're familiar with. And I imagine some of our state forestry people who are on will be the most familiar. Okay, so this makes some sense that the lead contender here is regional hydrologists, and that those are often the partners we reach out to. Watershed improvement programs, about a quarter of the responders, watershed program specialist also makes sense, at 40%. So actually a little teeny bit ahead of regional hydrologists. Those two are the main ones. So thank you very much for responding to this poll. And Jim, I noticed that regional fisheries biologist gets a lot of votes as well. So I think you've just made a good case. And you were very modest, but I know that you were involved and sort of the key person in instigating the Drinking Water Providers Partnership. So I hope that others will learn from this presentation, and we'd love to see more of that going on across the country. Okay. So now I'm going to introduce Shasta Ferranto, who is also from the Forest Service region in the Pacific Northwest. And Shasta is going to be talking about wildfire risk reduction across the National Forest Service system. She's the Regional Wildfire Crisis Coordinator. I can only imagine how stressful and important a job that is. She's the Assistant Director also for Fire, Fuels, and Aviation. The presentation is going to discuss several Forest Service programs working to reduce wildfire risk to at-risk communities and highly valued resources, including source water. So Shasta, take it away. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. And as Sylvia mentioned, I'm going to share with you about several programs the Forest Service has in place to reduce wildfire risk to communities as well as to natural resources. And before I do that, I want to take a moment just to give you some background. So all of the work I'll talk about today is grounded in the interagency cohesive wildland fire strategy. This strategy was published in 2014, so it's 10 years old, but it's stood the test of time because it's still in place and still highly valuable and used by pretty much everyone in this work. So this strategy established 3 complementary goals to address wildfire risk, and they're shown in the 3 concentric circles of this diagram. At the top is the goal of fire-adapted communities. So under this goal, communities are as prepared as possible to receive, respond to, and recover from wildfire. This includes activities like establishing defensible space around homes and also asset hardening. Just down to the right is the goal of safe and effective wildfire response. Now, we know that we'll always have to respond to wildland fire when critical values are at risk, such as people's homes and communities. And our goal is to do so in the safest and most effective way possible. And finally, to the left is the goal of resilient landscapes. And encompassed in this goal is restoring healthy, functioning ecosystems that can withstand naturally occurring fire. In early 2022, the Forest Service released a national strategy to address the wildfire crisis. And you'll see these 3 themes from the cohesive wildland fire strategy reoccurring throughout this strategy, as well as other organization strategies. The Forest Service strategy is an all-land strategy focused in the Western United States, where wildfire risk is the highest. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on those strategies just because I have a lot of content to share with you today, but I am sharing links. So if you're interested, you can go learn more on your own. But what I want to do before I get into the opportunities, I want to pause for a second and just talk about risk. So when we talk about wildfire risk, we're always talking about risk in relation to something else. So we ask the question, wildfire risk to what? Here are some examples of values we use for calculating risk. Risk to homes, risk to infrastructure, habitat, or probably of most interest to this group, one that we always look at is risk to drinking water. In the Pacific Northwest, the primary fire risk tool used by fire and resource managers, community planners, and natural hazard planners to manage fires and mitigate risk is called a quantitative wildfire risk assessment, or shorthand, we call it a QWRA. So the QWRA assesses overall fire risk across the landscape. It asks, what values do you have on your landscape that are at risk to fire? So those are those values that I showed in the past slide, or anything else that might want to be included. How is each value impacted by different intensity fire? So it doesn't take a universal fire bad, no fire good sort of approach, but looks at different intensities of the same resource. At a very low intensity, fire might be beneficial, whereas at a very high intensity, fire might be detrimental. And so we can actually incorporate this into our risk modeling. And then finally, it looks at what fire intensity is the most likely to occur on different parts of the landscape. So as I mentioned before, values can include things like homes, infrastructure, wildlife habitat, recreation, drinking water, etc. Really anything that is of high value to society, you could include in this analysis, but those are the common ones that get included. So in the Pacific Northwest, we have an interagency QWRA for the entire Pacific Northwest region. We're very lucky in that not every region has this type of analysis, and this is just an amazing tool. This was first released in 2018, but given significant changes in Oregon and Washington from recent wildfires, an updated assessment was just completed this past fall. The 2023 update was facilitated and managed by Oregon State University in close collaboration with a leadership team that included representatives from the Forest Service, the BLM, Washington Department of Natural Resources, and Oregon Department of Forestry. So this is really an interagency effort. And the map that you're looking at shows the expected loss if a wildfire were to happen based on a range of weighted values, including those listed in the previous slide. The bright orange areas represent the areas at highest risk of loss. We can also pull out individual layers to look at a risk to a specific value, such as the drinking water, as shown on this slide, where red areas indicate the highest risk again. And so I'm going to zoom into the Portland area just to show you an example. So this is the zoom in, and you can see just how important risk reduction on national forests is to protecting drinking water for this area. One of our wildfire crisis landscapes is in this area, and I'll talk about those in just a moment, the Mount Hood landscape. And on the Mount Hood landscape, we have the Bull Run watershed, which supplies drinking water to nearly 1 million people in Portland and surrounding communities. More than a third of all Oregonians depend on water from this national forest. And you see kind of in the upper center of the screen, that watershed just pops out in bright red. Of course, it's not the only area that's important. Okay, so now that we've talked at how we look at risk, I want to share a handful of programs focused on reducing risk. So you just learned about the BIL, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to highlight two provisions that I've been most deeply involved with in these funding bills, which is the funding dedicated to reducing wildfire risk on national forest system lands by reducing hazardous fuels. So within the bill and the IRA, we received $1.4 billion from the bill and $1.8 billion from the IRA. Now, again, I want to highlight, this is just two of the provisions in the law. So I'm not implying that this is everything available out there, but these are the two very specific provisions for reducing hazardous fuels on national forest system lands. And within these two provisions in the bill and the IRA, the Forest Service was provided very specific direction on how to prioritize this funding. So this included prioritizing work in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, as often people shorthand refer to it, public drinking water source areas strategically important for reducing risk, and the QWR that I just mentioned is one of the tools we use to get at that. Areas that retain large trees and fire resilient stands, areas that maintain or restore old growth stands, and then again, restricted to national forest system, just for these two provisions. So one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this is that public drinking water source areas was actually called out in the legislation as one of the priorities for this work. We use this direction, as well as the wildfire crisis strategy that I mentioned earlier, to develop success metrics for our work. So on the left, we have community risk and safety. This category includes reducing transmission of wildfire from NFS to communities. Now, we're very careful about the terminology, transmission from NFS to communities, because the reality is we could do everything on national forest systems, and that doesn't guarantee that a fire is not going to reach a community. And so, I highlight that to say that this really is an all lands type of problem that we have to use all land solutions to address. But in terms of the work we're doing just on NFS lands, it's important to us to know that we're not transmitting fires, or we're doing everything we can to reduce the transmission of fires to our adjacent communities. In addition, supporting municipal water supply, we've included under community risk and safety, and then of course that safe and effective wildfire response. On the right is ecosystem values and resilience. So this includes increasing landscape resiliency, such as the cohesive wildland fire strategy calls for, protecting important ecosystem and local values, and reducing compounding stressors and risks, such as insect and disease or climate change. All right, so the Forest Service is leveraging this funding strategically to move the needle in some of the highest risk landscapes in the Western United States. Our Fire Modeling Institute, which is out of our research and development side of the agency, identified the highest risk fire sheds across the country based on risk to homes and infrastructure. These were used to identify 21 wildfire crisis landscapes where the majority of the BIL and IRA funding from those two provisions are being targeted. Again, I just want to highlight, I'm only talking about those two provisions. I'm going to get into some of the others later in the presentation. And so you'll see in this map, you can see that black outlines show where all of those landscapes are. The ones that are hatched with the crosshatch, those are the first cohort, which were announced in 2022. And then the open polygons are the second cohort, which were announced in 2023. And then those red and orange are the high risk fire sheds. All right, so you can see the orange on top. I'm just summarizing these for the Pacific Northwest because that's the region I work in. So these are the data I have readily available. But I'll say that this goes more broadly than just Oregon and Washington. So in orange, I've highlighted from fiscal year 22 to 24, how much funding in millions of dollars we received to do this work. So you can see these are significant numbers. I talked about the bill and the IRA for those two specific provisions. And now I want to talk about some of our other programs. And so I don't have time to go through all of these. And I'll be honest, I'm not the expert in all of these, but I do want to highlight some of the biggest hitters up here in the top that I've highlighted in red. So I'll talk about community wildfire defense grants, collaborative forest landscape restoration program, as well as Joint Chiefs program. But I just have these others on here to show you that there are many other things. And these are just the programs related to wildfire risk reduction or post-fire recovery. All right, so let's start with Community Wildfire Defense Grants Program. So the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program is intended to help at-risk local communities and tribes plan for and reduce the risk of wildfire. Individual grants can fund up to $250,000 to create and update community wildfire protection plans and up to $10 million to implement wildfire resilience projects identified in a community wildfire protection plan. So this came from the bill. This is one of the other provisions that has funding, and this is for work on non-Forest Service lands. This is for work on other land ownerships. The dots on the map show projects that were funded in 2023, and the green polygons show our WCS landscapes, which we expect an announcement for the round 2 selections this spring. For the round 1 selection of projects, $200 million was allocated across all of those blue dots. And the provision provided $1 billion total for this work. So you might be wondering who's eligible to apply for this funding stream. Well, the provisions define at-risk communities as units of local government representing communities located in an area with risk of wildfires. So you can think of things like counties, cities, resource conservation districts, local fire departments. Any of these are eligible to apply. State forestry agencies, Indian tribes and Alaska Native corporations, and then nonprofit organizations that assist at-risk communities. And I'll share that in the first round, funding recipients in the Pacific Northwest included several soil and water conservation districts, as well as a local watershed organization. All right, and I'm just checking my times. I have a couple minutes left. So I'll just highlight these last few. The Joint Chiefs is a partnership created between NRCS and the Forest Service in 2014. So it's been around for about 10 years. And it funds work both on national forests and private lands to support an all lands approach. This was codified into law with the bipartisan infrastructure law. So although the program started before then, it got codified under that law. And it includes a yearly request for proposals. If funded, it provides 3 years of funding. These proposals are developed at the local level through a collaborative process between NRCS, the Forest Service, and partners. Past partners have included counties, state, non-governmental organizations, tribes, utilities, or private individual stakeholders. The collaboration process and partnerships depends on the specific community needs of each project, but the proposals are actually submitted by the local NRCS and Forest Service offices to the national agency offices. And then the proposals are reviewed and vetted at multiple levels in the agencies based on local, state, tribal, and regional port priorities. I want to highlight that this program is a really great fit in areas with checkerboard ownership patterns because it funds both work on public lands as well as work off public lands. And these are just some best practices that have been learned over the last 10 years of doing Joint Chiefs. So scale should be appropriate to the challenge. Locally led, local coordination is critical, strong partnerships, and built-in flexibility to changing conditions. All right, and then last I want to talk about the CFLRP. This was created by Congress in 2009 to invest in and encourage collaborative approaches to restoration at a landscape scale. With a particular emphasis on reducing wildfire risk, along with providing a suite of ecological benefits and promoting the health and well-being of communities. It's a competitive 10-year funding opportunity. So once you get selected, it's funding for 10 years, which is pretty phenomenal, with the possibility for extension. Proposals are developed with collaborative partners and get submitted through Forest Service units, and then they're evaluated by a national FACA, or Federal Advisory Committee Act group, and selected by the Secretary of Agriculture. So these projects are very collaborative, and in fact, you have to have a local collaborative in place for the Forest Service to apply. Per the original legislation, the funding can only be used for implementation and monitoring on NFS land, so it can't be used for planning. The funds can cover up to 50% of the costs, with up to $3 million in discretionary funds per project per year. And the remainder of funds can come from other Forest Service dollars, including BIL funds and partner contributions. This map shows where our active CFLRPs are across the country. And you might notice that they aligned, many of them, with our wildfire crisis landscapes. This is, of course, no coincidence, because these are some of our highest risk communities. I'm going to skip through these tools. I'm over time, so I'm going to skip past these best practices, and I'm going to finish on this community navigator slide. So this is a new opportunity. It's just been stood up this last year, called the Community Navigators Program. The program is intended to increase the ability of private forest landowners, communities, and organizations to carry out important work related to climate mitigation and forest resilience practices, reducing wildfire risk, as well as several others. We've partnered with the organizations shown on this screen, and essentially the point of this program is to help local community organizations and members access resources. We know that it's very difficult to figure out how to even what the programs are and how to access them from the outside. And so the point of these community navigators is to provide that assistance to help people understand what programs they're eligible to apply for and what the process is for applying. So I've included a link to more information, as well as an email that you can contact if you'd like to get in touch with one of the local community navigators. You can also reach out to any of these partners as well. All right, apologize for being a couple minutes over, but that is my last slide. And again, here's my contact information if you'd like to reach me with any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Shasta. We were actually ahead of schedule, so your couple of minutes is just fine. I wanted to ask you the QWRA that you mentioned toward the beginning. Is that something that the general public can access and learn from? And then what do you know about which other regions have something like that available?
Yeah, so the recent update to the 2023 QWRA, I don't believe the data has been made available yet. I think they're in the process of making that data available, but it will be. So right now, I think we're limited, the public's limited to accessing the 2018 data, but it will be available soon. And there was a link I provided on that slide if you'd like to sign up to get updates on when that 2023 QWRA be available. For those of you not in the Pacific Northwest, it really depends. I know that I don't know of any other region that's done an entire region-wide QWRA, but I do know that California has some more smaller scale QWRAs in place, and I know it's a tool that's been used elsewhere in the country, but I don't know exactly where other regions are using it.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps. I'm happy to get more information on those if folks are interested.
That's a great tool. Some of the programs that you mentioned had different lengths of time that they were funded. So one question is, why fund for just 3 years when follow-up management is needed for much more than just those 3 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're really limited by the direction we're given when Congress appropriates funds. So what's great about the CFLRP, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, is that the legislation that started that program allowed for that funding to be allocated for 10 years. But for other projects, you know, the funding allocation is for 3 years. You know, the Joint Chiefs, now that one we started before the congressional funding. I wasn't part of that, so, you know, I can only guess what the reasons were. I don't know for a fact, but I do know that the intent behind the Joint Chiefs is really to kickstart work. You know, it's really meant to be seed funding. So I think that the 3 years is meant to kind of be some seed funding to get the work started, but the intent isn't necessarily for that program to fund in perpetuity. I'll also add that I didn't highlight it in the presentation, but at least on Forest Service lands, we do have, you know, programs in place just through our annual appropriations for doing this work. And so those are also part of part of the resources getting leveraged. And I know similar is true in NRCS, although I'm less familiar with those resources since I don't work for the organization.
Okay. Do you have, you had the CFLRP, I think is the acronym for one of those programs you mentioned. How is that different from the U.S. Forest Service's landscape scale restoration program? Or are they part of the same?
Yeah, so CFLRP is for that work gets implemented on Forest Service lands. So it's a collaborative process with communities, but the actual work is on Forest Service lands. I'm less familiar with the landscape restoration program, but I do know that program is through our state and private forestry division. So I presume that that's for work on non-Forest Service lands.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and pause there and move into poll question number 3. And thank you again, Shasta.
Thanks very much, Shasta and Kathy. So poll number 3, looking to see what kinds of experience people have in leveraging these kinds of funds that we've been talking about. And Shasta, your experience was really great to hear about. And I want to reiterate that this webinar is recorded, as well as the PowerPoints, and the recording and the PowerPoints will be posted on the Source Water Collaborative website about a week after the webinar, as well as additional resources. And one resource I want to mention that we just received this morning from U.S. Forest Service headquarters is a list of soil and water contacts across the country, which I'm imagining will be useful in your ability to reach out. And we'll include that as a resource document on the Source Water Collaborative website for this webinar. Okay, so here's the results of the poll. And the most experience is in encouraging an organization you're partnering with to apply for or leverage funds, which is a great method to access these funds. And second, after that, is reaching out to a U.S. Forest Service contact in terms of what you plan on doing after this webinar. And that document I just mentioned, hopefully will be helpful. Thank you. Okay, now we're going to introduce our penultimate speaker, Matt, sorry, I'm having a little trouble here with my glasses. Matt Piccirillo, who is the Forest and Watershed Health Manager with the Rio Grande Water Fund and the Nature Conservancy. He's going to be giving us some perspective from outside the Forest Service and the partnership approach that they've taken. Matt's work focuses on building collaborative and community-based solutions to forest and watershed management through such initiatives as the Rio Grande Water Fund and the Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition. Matt's work also explores the role of fire as a key disturbance in New Mexico's forests and how various stakeholders can work together to build fire-adapted communities and resilient landscapes. Matt, take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Sylvia. Yeah, Matt Piccirillo, Forest and Watershed Health Manager with TNC. Been with TNC for 2 years and a couple weeks, actually. As Sylvia said, my work lies the intersection between communities, forests, fire, and water. I could probably give this presentation, it would last an hour and to talk about all the different things, but I'm going to keep it to my 15 minutes and try to focus on a couple key things that are relevant to the discussion today. Brief thing about the Water Fund, it was started in 2014. So I'll explain the tagline here, adapting to meet the moment, what that means, what the moment that we are in is. But a lot has changed since 2014. There's been a lot of treatments in the landscape. The funding landscape has changed. And so we're working with some colleagues at the Nature for Water facility, which is a partnership between Nature Conservancy and Pegasus Consulting Firm. I have a link to their website at the end of the presentation, and they're helping us go through this adaptation phase so that we can meet the moment and bring the Water Fund into the next 10 years, the back half of our 20-year planning horizon. Okay. All right, so I like to start presentations with this recently, this picture of 2 forms of infrastructure, and I have to give credit to our partners at the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. One of our partners there said, we need to treat our watersheds as infrastructure. And it's an excellent message to take to irrigation district boards and water utility boards that I think it's easy to wrap your head around infrastructure like concrete and things like that that require maintenance, but it's overlooked the green infrastructure in our watersheds as infrastructure, which really need the same sense of urgency to address things like wildfire risk, certainly in the West. And so, yeah, I've started and ended presentations with this. So I start here, and then at the end of the presentation, hopefully folks will come around to realizing, yeah, we need the same sense of urgency and funding dedicated to the pre-fire work as we do the post-fire work, which is sort of easy to understand why we need to invest in a watershed and the concrete, but the green infrastructure needs that urgency as well. And prevention is a lot cheaper, and you get a lot better outcomes to address wildfire risk pre-fire than if you're just doing post-fire. And this picture here on the right is the Little Oso diversion. So I'm going to talk a lot about the San Juan Chama project, which is where the city of Albuquerque and city of Santa Fe and many others in New Mexico get their drinking water. Some more details about that, but this is a very special diversion here that features heavily in New Mexico's water landscape. So where we started with the Water Fund and why it was created, in 2011, the Las Conchas wildfire, at the time, the largest wildfire in New Mexico history, 156,000 acres, caused the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority to have to shut down their surface water intake for about 40 days because of all the ash and debris that were in the Rio Grande, and so they didn't want to damage their equipment. And that was the wake-up call, I'd say, for like the general public. Certainly forestry and fire professionals and water professionals were aware of the risk, but that was sort of like, okay, this happened. It's not gonna, the problem isn't going to go away. And there were immediate impacts to water resources. A lot of communities, Santa Clara Pueblo, specifically one community that's still dealing with the post-fire flooding and erosion and just trying to get their watersheds back. It's a slow process. If you can imagine a huge landscape scale fire, I've got some pictures in a minute here of what that looks like when you lose a watershed to a high severity fire. And then in 2022, now dwarfing the Las Conchas fire, the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon wildfire burned 341,000 acres. So the problem isn't going away. If anything, it's getting worse. Fortunately for the Rio Grande watershed, this fire was outside of that, but unfortunately for the folks on the other side of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, they're experiencing the same effects that folks in the Rio Grande watershed experienced during Las Conchas. So yeah, the problem isn't going away. Fortunately for the Rio Grande watershed and water users on this side of the mountains, because of all the work that's happened since 2014, we haven't had one of these big landscape scale fires. There's been several incidents where prescribed fires and fuels reduction treatments where a wildfire has run into those treatments and firefighters were able to suppress it, including one during the same time that the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon wildfire was burning, same fire conditions, but yeah, firefighters are able to suppress that fire, which highlights something interesting about doing risk reduction work is the success is often completely invisible because you can't claim that some 300,000 acre fire didn't happen because of treatments that fire might have run into and then was suppressed. So just an interesting note that I like to share is, our success is invisible. We will never know what happened, thankfully, if a wildfire runs into one of our treatments. Also, it's important to highlight with Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon that fire, well, those two fires were caused by prescribed fires that got out of control, which should never have happened. It's a complete disaster, especially for the folks on the other side of the mountains who are dealing with it day in, day out. But it's difficult to have a conversation about risk reduction and watershed restoration without talking about prescribed fire as a tool, because it does remain a very important tool for reducing risk in these forested watersheds. But I feel it's important to highlight that fire happened from an escape prescribed fire. So things have shifted to make prescribed fire safer, but certainly it's not without risk, and don't want to go on without acknowledging the harm that caused for folks on the east slope of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. So I also like to ground us in the vision of the water fund. So the Rio Grande Water Fund invests in the restoration of forested lands upstream so we can secure pure fresh water. And our goal is to generate sustainable funding over the next 20 years to proactively increase the pace and scale of forest restoration. So really set up to address the bottleneck and gap of not having funding to do this work. The landscape has certainly changed since 2014. That's something I'll talk about of what the moment is. The moment, in short, is just there's more funding available, but that doesn't solve all our problems, and there's no guarantees that money touches down everywhere we need it to. But yeah, grounded firmly in the conservation finance side and payment for ecosystem service and addressing that issue in the Rio Grande watershed is why the water fund was established. And there have been other benefits to the collaboration that partners have engaged in over the last decade. Capacity building, the water fund has funded a lot of smaller collaborative groups and NGOs to enable the work to get done. So we didn't always just fund direct fuels reduction, we did that as well, but also capacity building. And so on the left here, if you haven't seen images of what a catastrophic wildfire looks like, this is what it looks like to water resources and the landscape. So the upper picture is Cochiti Reservoir, which is above Albuquerque, and you can see the difference in water quality there. And then the bottom picture is the Jemez Mountains. I believe this is pre-monsoon season. And so, once a fire that's that severe, that hot burns through, there's nothing to hold back the water. The soils are hydrophobic, and you get massive debris flows and long-term damage to your watersheds. So this is a map of the Rio Grande Water Fund. This is the entire landscape, stretches down south of Albuquerque to Belen, and then up into Colorado on both the main stem of the Rio Grande on the east side, and then on the west side, the Rio Chama. And I'm going to talk a lot about this area circled here in red. So this is the San Juan Chama project, which is a transbasin diversion. So piping water from the Colorado River system into the Chama River in the Rio Grande, and then conveyed onto the Rio Grande and south. In terms of like bang for your buck, where the most water users water originates, this is it. This is where the Albuquerque Bernalillo ABQUA is the short way to say the acronym. The water users, water providers in Albuquerque, and the irrigators down in the middle Rio Grande area. This is where their water comes from. Upwards of 90% of Albuquerque's water, upwards of 50-60% of Santa Fe's water. So Albuquerque saw significant decreases in their water table from groundwater pumping. So recently having shifted to more surface water from the San Juan Chama project, very important source of water. It's also not subject to the Rio Grande Compact, is my understanding. So, we, New Mexico, have to deliver water to Texas and downstream Rio Grande native water, but the San Juan Chama water is not subject to that compact. So it's a very important source of water for several reasons. So a little more about these particular watersheds and some of the work we've done, prioritization and effectiveness mapping, modeling. So my colleague Steve Bassett, who's our conservation director, worked with Pyrologics, which is a modeling firm, to develop these maps. So on the left, showing the San Juan Chama project source watersheds, as well as the diversions and the tunnels. That is our priority. Those are our priority treatment areas. So in red, what we did is filter out high slopes. We filtered out wilderness areas and Colorado roadless areas, and focused on where are the areas that we can actually do implementation. A couple important things about the watersheds. You'll notice all the green in 2 out of 3 of them. So that is Forest Service, but wilderness. There's some lighter green non-wilderness in the Blanco diversion, which is the northern watershed there. The biggest watershed, and the one that supplies the most water to the San Juan Chama project, is predominantly private land. And this is where a lot of the work that the Rio Grande Water Fund has funded through our partners, the Chama Peak Land Alliance and others, have done a lot of our work and focus there because, again, the wilderness issue impacts our ability to do mechanical treatments and things like that. On the right, we call this the green shadow map. So knowing that we can't cut every single one of these priority acres for all sorts of reasons, we did some effectiveness modeling that shows what we know is that if you do a 100-acre treatment, let's say, the benefits of that treatment are going to extend beyond the 100 acres. And so the green shadow is showing the effectiveness of those treatments that we have been able to fund or that have occurred in these watersheds. And so the more you put your treatments together, the larger the footprint, the bigger that effectiveness shadow is. Makes sense. But again, our success in some ways is invisible. We can't show the benefit from a fire that never happened. And so this is the closest we can get is to doing this modeling, so we can try to put our investments in the best places to have the most impact. And so this is a tool that we'll use going forward. And largely in these watersheds, we're funding fuels reduction. So thinning, mastication, very little timber removal, just because the wood there is not high value in terms of a financial standpoint. But yeah, fuels reduction, some aspen stand restoration to reduce the risk of wildfire in these watersheds. So the moment, as I said earlier, the moment is why we're here to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act and others. So in 2014, I think I've got a thing here. Yeah, $12 million was invested in hazardous fuels on Forest Service lands. Now, in year one of the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, $11.8 million will touch down just in the Enchanted Circle Priority Landscape, which is one of those wildfire crisis landscapes. So big increase in funding, both from the federal side and from the state. And so how do we work within this landscape of funding? What is needed? Is it on private lands? Is it planning? Is it prescribed fire? What are the areas that we can plug in and fill gaps? So I know Shasta had this map as well, showing the wildfire crisis strategy, but I put it up here to highlight that there are still gaps in funding. So the San Juan Chama project source watersheds are circled there in red, and there's not a priority watershed, even though that is, or fireshed, even though that is where most New Mexicans get their water. So it's not not bashing the wildfire crisis strategy, but just highlighting the reality that all of this funding, it's competitive, both internal to the Forest Service and to partners. And there is still a need to leverage multiple sources of funding, which is something that the Water Fund and other similar types of water fund schemes can bring to the table, because we can mix all those different pots of funding in order to put the money down on the ground in the places that's needed most. I'm running a little short on time, so I just want to touch briefly on our fundraising strategy and what the funding looks like from our partners. So we pool together funding from private foundations and businesses. A big part of our strategy is payment for ecosystem services. So General Mills has a snack and cereal plant in Albuquerque. So they're getting their water from the Rio Grande basin. And so they provide money on an annual basis the last several years to the water fund. And then the main water users, again, are the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority and the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. And these graphics pulled from their websites and documents just highlight how important that source of water is for these two water users. And yeah, so we're always looking for strengthening those relationships and partnerships and trying to help explain, again, that green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure, why it's important to invest in these source watersheds. So the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program, I know Shasta talked about it as well, but I wanted to highlight a few things, skip over the eligible land since Shasta covered that. But in the red box there, I've added the or FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan, because that's not always highlighted. We know that community wildfire protection plans is where you have to have a project documented. But I think if you're used to source water protection, you may not be as much in the fire planning or community wildfire protection planning space. And so this is a way that you can also have projects identified that can be funded by this grant program. So I like to highlight that. And then also, again, if you're not typically involved in the fire space, it behooves us all to think broadly beyond just fire, just forestry, to look at source water protection, water habitat, because there might be opportunities that aren't your go-to if your particular specialty is only in fire or only in aquatic habitat or something like that. So think broadly in terms of funding that can pay for source water protection. And then I wanted to highlight these details because they're important. These are the all or nothing points. So low income community. I could say a lot about that. The process has improved. I'll say the first round, much of New Mexico is not considered low income, even though it was like we're like the 49th state in terms of income, due to just a quirk in how that was determined. But I think that's been fixed. But it's 0 or 10 points. Affected by a severe disaster, 0 or 10 points. High, very high wildfire hazard potential, 0 or 20. So make sure these things are in place before you apply, because it would be difficult to get funded if you didn't have those in place. Am I doing all right, Kathy, to keep going? I've got like 1 or 2 more slides. One more slide, this one, and then my question slide. I also wanted to give a plug for post-fire planning, to not forget about that. It's easy to focus on the pre-fire and fuels reduction, but doing pre-fire, post-fire planning is really important. Colorado does a very good job of that with their Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. So I'd encourage folks to check that out, because yeah, it's something that we often wait till the fire happens to plan for. And that's it. I quickly just the resources here. So if you're interested in finding all the different programs that are funded through the different infrastructure acts, those are the first 3 bullets. The Conservation Finance Network is a really good resource if you're looking to diversify the different ways to fund source water protection. The Rio Grande Water Fund's website, and the last 2 are TNC's Global Resilient Watersheds Network and Nature for Water, which does do fee-for-service consulting for folks that want to set up a watershed investment program. So sorry for going a little over.
That's quite all right. Thank you so much, Matt. And just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so you all will be able to go back and find some of these links later. And since we are just a minute or 2 behind, then I'm going to go right into our last speaker. And Sylvia, if you want to go ahead and introduce her.
Okay, thanks very much, Kathy, and thank you, Matt. That was really great. And I'm happy to introduce Julie Harvey from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. She's the Drinking Water Protection Program Coordinator. She's involved in the Drinking Water Providers Partnership that Jim talked about, and she has a lot of experience partnering with the organizations we've talked about today. So I thought it would be great to ask her to weigh in and give us her perspective, and then we'll hopefully have time for a few questions at the end. Hi, thanks, Julie.
Yeah, and this will be pretty quick, but I think definitely having that state's perspective is an important piece to sort of all of the other work that is out there. And so if you want to just, I only have 1 slide after this one, and then I just have some talking points for you. And I think this really exhibits, this is one of the figures that's on our website that really shows how much the U.S. Forest Service and BLM, for that matter, are such important partners in Oregon. These are our surface water, drinking water source areas. And you can see that, you know, the Forest Service land covers about 33% of all of our surface water source areas. And when you add in the BLM, it's about 45%. So those headwaters areas are really important for drinking water protection within Oregon. So I think that's all that we need the slides for. And maybe I'll just talk through some, you know, various points that, you know, we recognize that source water protection can happen at an individual public water system level, a regional level, a statewide level. And we see this relationship building with the Forest Service and BLM as being critical for that regional protection of headwaters. There's also a number of groundwater protections benefits on those Forest Service lands. The Drinking Water Providers Partnership has recently supported some beaver habitat, like restoration projects, which we know, you know, supplies groundwater and keeps that clean as well. Some work in the Walla Walla Basin over on the eastern side of our state, where there's a really strong groundwater surface water connection. So both groundwater and surface water really benefits from that. So I guess my tips from a source water protection coordinator perspective is, one is to figure out who your contacts are at the Forest Service. And I think that all of the speakers here have provided some good context for that. For us, it's the regional hydrologists and the regional fisheries biologists. When I connected with Jim, that just made everything so much easier to sort of figure out who's the right person at the Forest Service. We as source water protection coordinators need to learn and really lean into that Forest Service, both the lingo and the priorities. especially around aquatics, vegetation, and native species. You would not believe how much I've learned from Jim and my counterparts at the BLM as well on sort of what are the priorities, and then how do you mesh both drinking water and these other priorities to really present the case for the source water protection piece of it. We've also worked to get drinking water into the memorandum of agreement that our agency signs with Forest Service on general water quality issues. So having that out there has been really helpful. One thing maybe to look into is the Wyden Authority is what authorizes the Forest Service and BLM to enter into agreements for actions off of those federal lands. So that's how we can do projects that benefit the Forest Service lands that are downstream of them. Jim always explains it that the fish have to go through here to get there. So we're protecting that resource. And how we participate at the table is in providing our knowledge, especially for these grant applications, but for other things as well, as to how drinking water, what are the benefits to drinking water that happens during the scoring process for the grant applications, so we can provide that information. I think it's important that the Forest Service and BLM know about where our drinking water source areas are, both for those planning purposes as well as the emergency response on the fire side of things as well. And then I just wanted to have a quick highlight that how the state DEQ plays at the table on that drinking water providers partnership is that we have our own state grant program that is with drinking water local assistance set aside dollars. And when there is a good project that is a fit for things that the drinking water providers partnership wants, but also fits with the goals of our state program with those grant money, we will refer that project and have them reapply. They do have to go through the scoring process for the state's program, but that is one way that we can come to the table with some funding for this drinking water providers partnership. As a state, we can't plug money directly into it, but that's how we come and partner. So both on the technical side of things, helping them decide what are good projects, what it benefits drinking water, and then they come with the, what are the benefits for aquatics, fish, and habitat, so that we can merge those together to be good projects overall. So maybe with that, I'll stop and let Sylvia and Christine take over.
Great. Thank you so much for that valuable state perspective. That's important, especially at the beginning of this call. We did our first poll, and it was state source water programs and NGOs that constituted the majority of our audience here. One question that came in for Matt. There it is. Could you speak to how other water funds that TNC is involved in, and how can people in other states help launch a water fund?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kara. I put some info in the chat, but I could also speak to it briefly. So some other examples just off the top of my head. There's water funds all around the country. There's one in Minnesota. There's one in Maine. There's one not associated with TNC, not with the Resilient Watersheds program, but I think TNC is involved in it, the Peaks to People Water Fund in Colorado. They all take different shapes and have different governance structures and things like that. So just sharing that there are other examples around the country. And a good place to start, as I said, is the Resilient Watersheds, their website. You can see what the other priority projects are, flagship projects. And then the folks at Nature for Water, if you don't have any water funds in your area, they do fee for service work, and I think they have a call for proposal, and they work with governments, utilities, and others to provide the technical assistance to see if a water fund type mechanism might be possible in your area, in your context.
Thank you so much. Shasta, if you could help us answer a couple of questions that came in. Is the CFLRP receiving additional funds through BIL? Do you know?
Yes, sorry, my camera got a little shifted. Yes, the CFLRP did receive additional funds through BIL.
Okay, great. And the one of the acronyms that I'm not I don't know what it stands for. I know that we need to be familiar with it is the RAP. And I was wondering if you could define that acronym, and is that considered a QWRA?
I'm not familiar with that acronym. RAP, is that what you said?
Yeah, it's WRAP. I wonder if someone in our audience could define that for us. Maybe that's just a southeastern region.
For the Forest Service, I believe that's Watershed Restoration Action Plan.
That's
If you
it.
live in Colorado, it's a Wildfire Ready Action Plan. So same acronym, different program if you're in Colorado. And that's tied to the Watershed Condition Framework, I believe, is the RAPs for the Forest Service.
Well, Matt, since you're on here, we've got a question about invasive species. What non-native invasive species are most important to remove to control the wildfires and to reduce the water pollution that affects both safe drinking water and aquatic fish and wildlife?
Good question. It's actually not, largely speaking, not an issue of non-native species. It's so fuels reduction work, our priorities focusing on frequent fire forests, so forests that have historically had frequent fire return intervals. So a ponderosa pine forest, you might expect to burn anywhere from 1 to 10 years, you know, it's all an average. And so one of the reasons that we're having this wildfire crisis is because our forests are too dense. So why are they too dense? It's because in many places, most forests in the West, fire has been excluded for 100-ish years. It's been excluded in a variety of ways, just fire suppression. So Forest Service and other agencies just putting fires out as soon as they happened. Also livestock grazing. So sheep and cows eat grass. Grass used to carry fire. Without fire, then you get woody species and encroachment, and you get denser forests. Also logging in a lot of places. It really depends on the landscape, but I know like in the Zuni Mountains here in New Mexico, we're logged very heavily. So if you cut down all of the trees, and we happen to have very wet decades in the 80s and around that time, then you get lots of trees to grow up all at the same time, and you don't have that heterogeneity. So when you do get a wildfire, it's very thick, dense trees that can carry fire quickly, and it burns very hot because there's more fuel. So ideally, you'd have more patchy openings, more understory cover. But if you've ever stood in a dog hair thicket forest, you could kind of imagine why a fire would be more destructive there as opposed to something that's more open and has more grassy understory. That's a broad simplification of fire ecology and forestry in the West, but largely we focus on those frequent fire forests where fire would have occurred, as I said, every like 1 to 10 years or so.
Great. Thanks for your expertise on that. Sylvia?
Yep, thanks so much. I think, Kathy, unfortunately, it is time for us to start wrapping up. Thank you for mastering all those questions, and thank you so much to our speakers for their participation. I think you can tell that there's a lot of opportunity here, and also some of the challenges we've encountered in the past with partnerships. We speak different languages, there's different vocabulary, and I think you'll see when you get a chance to watch the recording again or share it with your partners, that there'll be some benefits from conversations that get generated and from the next steps we talked about in response to the earlier poll. Again, the recording will be available on the Source Water Collaborative website. You'll see the link on the next page. I just wanted to very briefly share this list of next steps, and we will have contacts, as I mentioned, for the Forest Service Soil and Water folks, and we'll put that on the website as well. Some of you mentioned that as a next step. And there was a link to the Watershed Condition Report in the chat. So we'll be including all of these important links from the presenters as well as from the people in this audience. So I appreciate all of you. I had some thoughts here, and I'm not going to go over them in specifics because of time, but we do have a link here for the Drinking Water Providers Partnership, National Association of State Foresters. You can look there for the Forest Action Plan in your state, which often mentions drinking water. They were just updated. under the Farm Bill, and those help get eligibility for funding. Your state Department of Forestry may have a link to financial assistance, including these federal programs. And the Source Water Collaborative, well, first of all, source water coordinators are in each state. There's a link for them. The source water contacts in EPA's regional offices, they're federal people just like the Forest Service, and they are very much focused on these opportunities. So I wanted to recommend them. And the Source Water Collaborative itself has a number of other resources in addition to the webinar. Also, it has collaboratives near you. It has the Learning Exchange Forestry Series, and we did a document for conservation districts and forestry. So I wanted to mention that. Let's go to the last slide really briefly. This will have a QR code. If you access this QR code, you'll be directed right to the BIL Learning Exchange website, and that's where you're going to find the webinar recording and associated resources for this webinar, as well as the previous ones, and the opportunity to register for the next webinar, May 30th, on BIL funding for disadvantaged communities for drinking water and environmental justice. And I think this, from some of the presentations today, we'll see some overlap there. So thank you so much for all your participation and the expert information we shared from each of the speakers. We really appreciate your participation. We know you're all really busy, and that goes for everybody in the audience. So thank you so much, and we'll look forward to putting together some resources, hopefully to help all of this move forward. Thank you so much.